You were nothing but a placeholder wife, my husband's mistress whispered at his funeral before spitting on my black wool coat. Richard made sure you'd leave with nothing. The lawyer standing beside her smirked like he'd already watched me lose everything. I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I simply looked down at the small stain sliding slowly across the fabric and tightened my fingers around the silver key hidden inside my coat pocket. 3 days later, that key destroyed all of them. I'm Evelyn Carter, and at 68 years old, I thought grief would be the hardest thing I'd ever survive. I was wrong. The chapel smelled like lilies, polished wood, and rain-soaked wool coats. Outside, a cold October storm rolled across Boston Harbor, turning the stained glass windows gray. Richard always loved rainy days. He used to say storms made the world honest because nobody could pretend the sky was beautiful when it was falling apart. I sat alone in the front pew while guests filled the chapel behind me in hushed voices. Some glanced toward me with pity. Others avoided my eyes entirely. 41 years of marriage had ended with me sitting beside a closed casket, feeling like a stranger at my own husband's funeral. The organ music echoed softly through the room while I stared at the white roses surrounding Richard's coffin. White roses. Vanessa's choice. She'd told the funeral director Richard hated red flowers because they looked too dramatic. I almost laughed when I heard that. Richard had planted red roses outside our first apartment 39 years ago because he said they reminded him that beautiful things required patience. But apparently his mistress knew him better now. Vanessa Hale arrived 20 minutes late wearing cream-colored heels and dark sunglasses despite the rain. Heads turned immediately. She walked through the chapel slowly, one hand resting against her chest like she was the grieving widow instead of the woman who had quietly inserted herself into my marriage. Her perfume reached me before she did. Something expensive and sharp that reminded me of hotel lobbies and champagne dinners. Martin Graves followed closely behind her carrying a leather folder under his arm. Richard's attorney for almost 20 years. A man who had eaten Christmas dinner in my home. A man who once called me family. When Vanessa slid into the pew across the aisle from me, Martin leaned close to whisper something into her ear. She smiled without looking at him. That smile unsettled me more than the rain pounding against the chapel windows. It was calm, certain, like someone arriving at the final scene of a story they already knew the ending to. The pastor began speaking about Richard's career, his generosity, his devotion to family. I lowered my eyes toward my gloved hands because I could no longer recognize the man being described. The Richard I buried that morning had spent the last year growing distant in ways I never fully understood. Late-night business dinners, locked phone screens, quiet tension settling into every room of our house like dust. Still, I stayed. Women from my generation always stayed. We learned how to survive silence better than confrontation. Halfway through the service, Vanessa stood and walked toward the casket. Her heels clicked sharply across the marble floor, each sound slicing through the pastor's words. She rested her fingertips against the polished wood and bowed her head dramatically. Several guests exchanged uncomfortable glances. Then she turned toward me. Slowly, deliberately. He suffered longer than he should have, she said softly, loud enough for nearby guests to hear. Some people hold on even when love is already gone. My chest tightened, but I remained still. I could feel Martin watching me carefully from behind her, waiting, measuring whether grief would finally break me apart in public. Vanessa stepped closer until she stood directly in front of me. Richard hated seeing you cling to him, she whispered, especially near the end. Then she looked down at my coat and spat lightly against the dark wool near my collarbone. Gasps rippled through the pews behind us. Vanessa tilted her head slightly and smiled. He left you penniless anyway. Martin Graves gave a low chuckle under his breath. Not shock, not discomfort, amusement. Something inside me turned cold at that exact moment. Not broken, not wounded, cold. Because suddenly I understood something terrifying. They weren't nervous. They thought they had already won. I slowly removed a folded handkerchief from my purse and dabbed the stain from my coat, while Vanessa watched for tears that never came. My fingers brushed the small silver key hidden deep inside my pocket. The last thing Richard had pressed into my palm before he died 2 nights earlier in the hospital. His voice had been weak, barely audible beneath the machines surrounding his bed. Don't trust Martin, he whispered. At the time, none of it made sense. Standing there in the chapel while rain battered the windows and Vanessa smiled down at me like a queen surveying ruins, I finally realized Richard hadn't given me that key out of guilt. He gave it to me because he knew exactly what was coming. The rain followed me home from the funeral like a second shadow. By the time I pulled into the driveway of our house in Beacon Hill, the sky had turned nearly black, and the porch lantern cast a weak golden circle across the wet brick steps. I sat in the car longer than necessary with both hands resting on the steering wheel, staring at the dark windows of the home Richard and I had shared for more than 4 decades. It no longer felt like mine. Maybe it had not for a very long time. The silver key remained tucked safely inside my coat pocket. Even through the fabric, I could feel its sharp edges pressing lightly against my palm. Richard had barely been conscious when he gave it to me at Massachusetts General Hospital. His skin had looked pale beneath the fluorescent lights, his breathing uneven and shallow. I remembered leaning closer to hear him over the machines beside his bed. "The boathouse," he whispered weakly. "Promise me you will go alone." At the time, I assumed the medication was confusing him. Richard had always loved the small boathouse behind our summer property in Cape Cod. He kept old fishing equipment there along with boxes of photographs and tools he never used anymore. I thought he was clinging to memories near the end. Now I understood there had been fear in his eyes that night. Real fear. I finally stepped out of the car and walked toward the house. The front door was unlocked. That unsettled me immediately because Richard never forgot to lock it, even during the worst weeks of his illness. The silence inside felt strange. Not peaceful. Watchful. I removed my wet coat slowly and froze when I noticed a champagne glass sitting on the kitchen counter beside a lipstick-stained napkin. Vanessa's shade. Deep crimson. My stomach tightened. The funeral had ended less than 2 hours earlier. Someone had already been inside my home. I moved carefully through the hallway, hearing only the grandfather clock ticking near the staircase. The family photographs lining the walls suddenly looked different to me. Vacations in Maine. Christmas mornings. Richard smiling beside me at our 40th anniversary dinner. I stopped at one picture taken 5 years earlier on Nantucket. Richard had his arm around my shoulders, but his smile looked distracted somehow, as if part of him had already stepped outside the frame long before I realized it. Upstairs, our bedroom smelled faintly of Richard's cologne and hospital antiseptic. The bed remained perfectly made because I had not slept there since he died. On his nightstand sat the silver watch I gave him for our 25th anniversary. Beside it was an envelope with my name written across the front in shaky handwriting. Evelyn. My chest tightened as I picked it up. Empty. Whatever had been inside was gone. I slowly opened Richard's closet and noticed several empty hangers pushed toward the back. 3 of his tailored suits were missing. So were 2 leather travel bags. Confusion spread through me like cold water. Richard had been too weak to leave the house during his final weeks. Someone else removed those things after he died. Or before. A floorboard creaked behind me downstairs. I held my breath. Then came the faint sound of a drawer closing in the kitchen. Someone was still inside the house. I quietly stepped into the hallway and looked down toward the first floor. A woman's voice drifted upward, followed by soft laughter. Vanessa. Another voice answered calmly. Martin Graves. I remained perfectly still at the top of the staircase while they moved through my kitchen below like they belonged there. She has no idea, Vanessa said with a quiet laugh. Poor Evelyn still thinks Richard loved her at the end. Martin chuckled softly. By tomorrow, the estate transfers will already be finalized. My fingers tightened around the wooden banister. Rain hammered against the windows while downstairs the 2 people who had humiliated me at my husband's funeral casually discussed dismantling the rest of my life. Then Martin said something that made the blood drain from my face. As long as she never finds what Richard hid in the boathouse, we are perfectly safe. I remained frozen at the top of the staircase while their voices drifted through the kitchen below me. Vanessa sounded relaxed now, almost cheerful, very different from the dramatic, grieving woman she had pretended to be at the funeral. I could hear the faint clink of glass as she poured herself another drink from the crystal decanter Richard kept beside the dining room bar. I still cannot believe he trusted her for so many years, she said with a low laugh. Evelyn never questioned anything. Martin answered calmly. Women like her usually do not, especially after 40 years of marriage. I felt those words settle heavily inside my chest because part of me knew he was right. I had spent decades believing loyalty guaranteed safety. I believed if you stood beside someone long enough, if you built a home together and survived enough winters together, eventually betrayal became impossible. Standing there in the dim hallway of my own house, I realized betrayal often grows best in places where trust has been left unattended for too long. I quietly stepped backward away from the staircase before either of them looked up. My heartbeat felt steady now, strangely steady. The panic from the funeral had disappeared somewhere between the chapel and this moment. In its place was something colder, clearer. I slipped back into the bedroom and closed the door silently behind me. Rain streaked against the windows overlooking the garden Richard and I planted 20 years earlier. Most of the roses had already withered for the season, leaving dark thorn stems twisting along the fence beneath the storm. I crossed toward the dresser and opened the bottom drawer where Richard kept old paperwork and insurance records. Empty. Every file folder was gone. Not scattered. Removed carefully, deliberately. Vanessa and Martin had already started cleaning the house before the funeral flowers were even dead. I reached into my coat pocket again and wrapped my hand around the silver key. The boathouse. Richard had repeated the words twice before dying. At the time, I thought he was confused from medication. Now I understood he had been trying to warn me while there was still time. Downstairs, footsteps crossed the marble foyer. Then Martin's voice lowered slightly. The transfer hearing is Friday morning. Once the judge signs off, the Cape property and investment accounts become legally untouchable. Vanessa laughed softly. Poor Evelyn will probably end up in one of those little retirement apartments outside Quincy. I closed my eyes briefly. 41 years of marriage reduced to strangers discussing where I might quietly disappear after they finished dismantling my life. The humiliation should have shattered me. Instead, it sharpened something inside me I had not felt in years. Instinct. I moved toward the closet and pulled out an old Navy suitcase from the upper shelf. The same suitcase Richard and I used during road trips along the Maine coast years ago, before money complicated everything around us. I packed quietly. 2 sweaters, a wool scarf, my medication, a flashlight from the bedside drawer. Then I opened the small safe hidden behind Richard's winter coats. Empty except for one object resting alone against the velvet lining. A photograph. Richard stood beside the Cape Cod boathouse wearing an old fisherman's jacket, his expression tense beneath the cloudy summer sky. On the back, written in his uneven handwriting, were 7 words that made my stomach tighten. If anything happens to me, trust nobody. A car door slammed outside. I moved carefully toward the bedroom window and watched Martin step into the rain while pulling his coat collar higher against the wind. Vanessa remained inside, near the front hallway mirror fixing her lipstick. Like she already owned the house. For several seconds, she admired herself in the reflection where my family photographs still hung behind her. Then she smiled. Not warmly. Triumphant. That was the moment I understood something important about women like Vanessa Hale. They do not simply steal husbands or money. They steal space, presence, identity. They slowly convince everyone around them that the woman who came before them no longer matters. I waited until her car finally disappeared down the wet street before picking up my suitcase. The grandfather clock downstairs struck midnight as I stepped quietly through the front door into the cold Boston rain. I did not know exactly what Richard had hidden inside that boathouse on Cape Cod, but for the first time since his death, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. Vanessa and Martin were afraid of it. The drive to Cape Cod took nearly 2 hours through heavy rain and thick coastal fog. The windshield wipers moved back and forth in a slow rhythm that reminded me of hospital monitors, steady and mechanical, the kind of sound that leaves too much room for memory. I had not visited the summer property since Richard became ill the previous spring. At first, he said the salt air irritated his lungs. Later, he simply stopped mentioning the place altogether. Around 3 in the morning, I finally turned onto the narrow gravel road leading toward the waterfront property. The old cedar house appeared slowly through the darkness, its weathered gray shingles slick with rainwater beneath the weak porch light. Richard bought the place 22 years earlier after closing a major investment deal in New York. At the time, he called it our fresh start. We spent summers there grilling seafood on the deck, drinking coffee beside the water at sunrise, pretending success had made life simpler instead of more fragile. The boathouse stood about 50 yards behind the main property near the shoreline, partially hidden behind tall sea grass bending violently in the storm. Even from a distance, I could see the rust spreading across the metal roof and the peeling white paint along the wooden doors. Richard had always refused to renovate it. Some places should age honestly, he once told me. I parked beside the house and stepped into the cold rain, clutching the silver key tightly in my hand. The ocean wind cut sharply through my coat as I walked toward the shoreline. Waves crashed against the rocks below with a hollow sound that echoed through the darkness. For a moment, I hesitated outside the boathouse door. Not because I was afraid of what I might find inside, but because I understood my life would divide itself into two versions after tonight. The woman before opening that door still carried pieces of illusion. The woman afterward would not. The key slid smoothly into the old lock. Richard must have maintained it recently. I pushed the heavy wooden door open and the smell of salt water, cedar, and motor oil drifted into the stormy air. Inside, everything looked frozen in time. Fishing poles lined one wall beside neatly organized tackle boxes. An old red canoe hung suspended from the ceiling beams. Richard's workbench remained cluttered with tools, yellow legal pads, and half-finished projects he no longer had the strength to complete. My flashlight beam moved slowly across the room until it stopped near the far corner. A metal filing cabinet stood against the back wall beneath a small security camera mounted above it. My stomach tightened immediately. Richard never installed cameras anywhere on the property. I crossed the room carefully and noticed a second lock attached to the filing cabinet drawer. The silver key fit perfectly. Inside were dozens of neatly labeled folders, several external hard drives, and a thick sealed envelope with my name written across the front in Richard's handwriting. My fingers trembled slightly as I opened it. Evelyn, if you are reading this, then Martin betrayed me sooner than I expected. I stared at the words while rain hammered against the roof overhead. Richard's handwriting looked weaker than usual, uneven in places like he struggled to finish each sentence. There are things about my business dealings and my relationship with Vanessa that you do not know. I wanted to protect you from the ugliness of it. That was my mistake. The room suddenly felt colder. I lowered myself slowly into the wooden chair beside the workbench and continued reading while the storm shook the old building around me. Vanessa was never supposed to become permanent. She was careless, ambitious, and far more connected to Martin than I realized at first. Over the past year, I discovered they had been moving money through offshore accounts using my company authority while I was too sick to monitor everything properly. When I confronted Martin, he threatened to expose details of the affair publicly unless I cooperated. My breathing slowed as each sentence dismantled another piece of the man I thought I knew. Richard had betrayed me. Deeply. Repeatedly. Yet beneath that betrayal was another truth even darker than infidelity. He had become trapped inside something he could no longer control. At the bottom of the letter, one final sentence stood alone beneath the others. The evidence is inside the blue hard drive. Do not trust anyone, not even Dylan. I read that line 3 times before the meaning fully settled into my chest. My own son. I did not cry after reading Richard's letter. That frightened me more than the betrayal itself. 41 years of marriage had collapsed into a stack of folders inside a damp boathouse on Cape Cod, and yet the only thing I felt was a strange calm spreading slowly through my chest. Outside, the storm continued pounding against the shoreline, but inside the boathouse, everything became painfully quiet. I reached for the blue hard drive Richard mentioned in the letter. It sat beneath several financial folders labeled with dates from the previous 18 months. My reflection looked pale in the small metal surface of the device as I turned it over in my hands. Richard always hated technology. The fact that he trusted something this important to a hard drive instead of paper told me how afraid he must have been near the end. I searched the workbench until I found his old silver laptop stored beneath a stack of marine maps. The battery barely held power, but after several long seconds, the screen flickered to life. The desktop background showed a photograph I had taken years ago during a winter trip to Vermont. Richard stood beside a frozen lake wearing a dark wool coat and smiling directly at me. Not distracted, not distant, just Richard before greed and secrets hollowed him out from the inside. For a moment, I stared at the picture longer than necessary. Then I connected the hard drive. A single folder appeared on the screen. Martin and Vanessa. Even seeing their names together made my stomach tighten. Inside were dozens of scanned documents. bank transfers, audio recordings, and private emails. At first, the files looked confusing, full of legal terminology and financial codes I barely understood. But the deeper I looked, the clearer the pattern became. Martin had quietly redirected money from Richard's investment accounts for over a year, using shell corporations connected to Vanessa's consulting business. Millions of dollars moved through accounts in the Cayman Islands and Luxembourg, while Richard's health declined. I opened one email dated 6 months earlier. Vanessa wrote with shocking confidence, "Richard is too weak to question anything now. Once the estate revisions are complete, Evelyn becomes irrelevant." Martin's response arrived 13 minutes later. "Keep him cooperative until after the trust transfer hearing. The widow will not have resources to fight us legally afterward." Widow. Not Evelyn. Not Mrs. Carter. Just widow. Like I had already become an inconvenience they planned to erase quietly. My fingers tightened around the edge of the desk as another realization settled over me. This was never simply an affair. Vanessa had not fallen in love with my husband. She had studied him, positioned herself beside him while Martin handled the legal machinery in the background. Richard became useful to them because illness made him vulnerable and guilt made him easy to manipulate. I continued scrolling through the files until I found a video recording labeled private. The timestamp showed it was recorded only 3 weeks before Richard died. My pulse slowed as I opened the file. The camera angle appeared hidden, possibly from inside Richard's home office. Richard sat behind his desk wearing a navy sweater, his face pale and visibly thinner than I remembered. Vanessa stood near the fireplace holding several legal documents while Martin remained beside him. "I already told you I want Evelyn protected," Richard said weakly. Martin's voice stayed calm and measured. "The updated trust still provides her with basic support. That is not what I asked for." Richard sounded exhausted. Vanessa crossed her arms slowly. "Richard, your son deserves stability. Dylan agrees this structure is better for everyone." Hearing my son's name made something cold move through my stomach. Richard lowered his head into his hands for several seconds before speaking again. "You are turning my family against each other." Vanessa's expression hardened slightly. "No, Richard. Your choices already did that." The recording ended abruptly after Martin slid paperwork across the desk toward him. I leaned back slowly in the wooden chair while ocean wind rattled the boathouse walls around me. Richard betrayed me. That truth remained unchanged. But now I could finally see the final year of his life clearly. He had been trapped between shame, illness, and people far more ruthless than he ever imagined. Then my phone vibrated suddenly across the workbench, making me flinch. Dylan. His name glowed across the screen beneath a photograph taken during his college graduation 12 years earlier. I stared at it for several seconds before answering. "Mom," he said quietly. "Where are you?" I looked down at the open laptop filled with evidence capable of destroying everything Vanessa and Martin built around themselves. Then I remembered the final line of Richard's letter. "Do not trust anyone, not even Dylan." I needed some air after the funeral, I replied calmly. There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Martin has been trying to reach you all morning," Dylan said carefully. "He says there are important estate documents you need to sign tomorrow." I closed my eyes briefly as rain continued striking the roof overhead. They were already moving faster now, faster than before, which meant they were scared. By sunrise, the storm had weakened into a cold, gray drizzle that blurred the Cape Cod shoreline outside the boathouse windows. I had not slept at all. The old wall clock above Richard's workbench ticked steadily through the night while I sorted through folders, recordings, and bank statements that slowly revealed how deeply Martin and Vanessa had entangled themselves around my husband's life. Every file felt like another layer of illusion peeling away. Around 7:30 in the morning, I finally closed the laptop and walked outside carrying a ceramic coffee mug I found in the kitchen of the summer house. The ocean looked steel gray beneath the clouds, restless and endless. Richard used to stand in this exact spot every morning during our summers here. He would sip black coffee and talk about retirement as if peace were something you could eventually schedule into your calendar. Looking back now, I think Richard spent his entire life chasing control because deep down he feared losing it. And in the end, that fear became the very thing that destroyed him. My phone buzzed again in my coat pocket. "Dylan." This time I answered after the second ring. "Mom, where are you?" His voice sounded strained now, less controlled than the night before. "I told you already." I said quietly. I needed time alone. There was silence for several seconds. Then I heard him exhale heavily. Martin says the probate documents have to be finalized today. Vanessa is already at the house with him. Hearing her name spoken so casually by my son tightened something inside my chest. Dylan had never liked conflict growing up. Even as a little boy, he would retreat from tension instead of confronting it. When Richard and I argued quietly behind closed doors, Dylan used to sit on the staircase listening in silence, pretending he was not afraid the family might split apart. That same silence lived inside him now as a grown man. Do you trust Martin? I asked suddenly. Another pause. Longer this time. He handled Dad's business for years. That was not my question. Wind moved through the seagrass beside the porch while I waited for his answer. Finally, Dylan spoke carefully. Dad trusted him. I closed my eyes briefly because that answer told me everything. Dylan did not know the full truth, but he knew enough to avoid direct honesty. Mom, he said, softly, whatever happened between Dad and Vanessa? Maybe it is better not to dig through all of it right now. Better for who, I wondered. But I did not say it aloud. Instead, I stared toward the dark waves crashing against the shoreline below the property. Your father left things behind that need explaining, I said calmly. Dylan's breathing shifted slightly on the other end of the line. Nervous. What things? That depends, I replied quietly. How much did you already know? Silence. Pure silence. Then finally, I knew Dad changed the trust. His voice sounded smaller now somehow. Martin said it was temporary while Dad was sick. I gripped the warm coffee mug tighter between my hands. And Vanessa? Another long pause. Dad told me she made him happy near the end. Happy. Such a small, harmless word for something that shattered an entire family. I remembered the recording from the hard drive. Richard looking exhausted while Vanessa stood over him beside the fireplace. There had been no happiness in his face. Only fear and shame. Did you ever wonder why your father suddenly hid financial documents from me after 40 years? I asked quietly. Dylan did not answer. Did you wonder why Martin insisted on handling everything privately once Richard became ill? Still silence. Then finally, Mom, please do not make this uglier than it already is. I looked down at my wedding ring resting against the coffee mug handle. Thin gold worn smooth by 4 decades of marriage. I had kept it on even after the funeral because removing it felt too final. But standing there on that cold Cape Cod shoreline, listening to my son ask me not to expose the people dismantling my life, something inside me finally settled into clarity. Dylan was not evil. He was weak. There is a difference. Weak people convince themselves silence is kindness because courage demands too much from them. I will be back in Boston tonight, I said calmly. Tell Martin not to prepare any documents for me to sign. Dylan inhaled sharply. Mom. And Dylan, I interrupted softly. If Vanessa is still inside my house when I return, I suggest you ask her to leave before things become very embarrassing for everyone involved. He went completely quiet after that. I ended the call and slipped the phone back into my pocket. Then I walked slowly toward the edge of the shoreline, where cold Atlantic waves rolled endlessly against the rocks below. Somewhere behind me inside the boathouse sat enough evidence to destroy careers, reputations, and fortunes. But as the ocean wind moved through my coat, I realized something even more dangerous than evidence had finally returned to me after all these months. Clarity. I returned to Boston just after sunset. The city streets glistened beneath fresh rain while yellow taxi lights reflected across the wet pavement like fractured pieces of gold. During the drive back from Cape Cod, I had replayed every conversation from the past year inside my head. Every missed anniversary dinner. Every strange silence from Richard. Every time Vanessa appeared unexpectedly beside him during charity events or business functions, while Martin quietly hovered nearby managing details nobody else questioned. Looking back now, the signs had not been subtle. I had simply refused to believe people capable of that level of calculation could exist inside my own life. The house on Beacon Hill looked warm from the outside when I pulled into the driveway. Soft golden light glowed through the front windows, and for one painful second, the scene resembled the kind of peaceful evening Richard and I once shared together. Then I noticed Vanessa's white Mercedes parked beside the curb. She was still there. I stepped inside carrying my overnight bag and immediately heard laughter drifting from the dining room. Vanessa's laugh, sharp and polished like crystal striking marble. The scent of expensive catered food filled the air. I slowly removed my coat and walked toward the dining room doorway. Vanessa sat at the head of my dining table wearing cream silk and diamond earrings while Martin poured wine beside her. Dylan sat across from them with both hands folded tightly together, his face pale beneath the chandelier light. The scene felt almost surreal. My husband had been buried less than 48 hours earlier, and already they had arranged themselves like a new family settling comfortably into place after replacing the previous one. Vanessa looked up first. For a brief moment, surprise flickered across her face before her polished smile returned. "Evelyn," she said smoothly. "We were beginning to worry." I glanced at the untouched plate sitting where Richard used to sit every evening for 41 years. Vanessa had placed herself in his chair. Of course she had. People like Vanessa always reveal themselves through small choices long before large ones. Martin adjusted his tie and stood slowly. "I attempted to contact you several times regarding tomorrow's probate hearing," he said calmly. "There are important documents requiring your signature." I set my overnight bag quietly beside the staircase. "I am sure there are." Dylan finally looked toward me. "Mom, maybe we should all sit down and talk calmly." Calmly. Such an interesting word people use when they want silence more than truth. Vanessa lifted her wine glass delicately. "We understand this transition has been emotional for you." Emotional for me. I almost smiled at the absurdity of it. "Richard cared deeply about making sure everyone was provided for appropriately," she continued. "The trust structure may feel complicated at first, but Martin has explained everything very carefully." I looked directly at her for the first time since entering the room. Her confidence remained almost perfect. Almost, but not entirely. There was tension now beneath her posture. Tiny fractures around the edges. Because somewhere beneath all her rehearsed composure, she knew something had shifted. Martin stepped closer holding a thin stack of legal papers. "These are preliminary acknowledgments only," he said. "Nothing adversarial." I did not take the documents from his hand. Instead, I walked slowly toward the dining room sideboard where framed family photographs still stood beneath the soft overhead lighting. One picture showed Dylan at age 10 holding a baseball trophy while Richard stood proudly beside him. Another showed our family during Christmas in Vermont years before Vanessa existed in any of our lives. I traced my fingers lightly across the frame. "Do you know what the strange thing about betrayal is?" I asked quietly without turning around. Nobody answered. It is rarely the affair people remember most. Or even the money. The room remained silent behind me except for the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. I finally turned back toward them. "It is how quickly people begin treating you like you are already gone." Vanessa's smile faded slightly. Martin lowered the papers. Dylan stared down at the table. I walked calmly toward my chair and pulled it out slowly. "I will not be signing anything tomorrow," I said. Martin's expression hardened immediately beneath his professional mask. "Evelyn, delaying probate proceedings could create significant financial complications." "For whom?" I asked softly. His jaw tightened. Vanessa set her wine glass down carefully. "You are making this unnecessarily difficult." I looked at her cream silk blouse, her diamond earrings, the expensive confidence she wore like armor inside my home. Then I remembered the email from the hard drive. The widow will not have resources to fight us legally afterward. Slowly, I reached into my purse and placed a small blue external hard drive directly onto the center of the dining table. The entire room went still. Martin's face lost color first. Vanessa stopped breathing for half a second. And Dylan finally looked at me with genuine fear. I folded my hands calmly in my lap. "Now," I said softly, "perhaps we should finally have an honest conversation." The silence after I placed the hard drive on the dining table felt heavier than shouting. Rain tapped softly against the tall windows while nobody moved for several long seconds. Vanessa stared directly at the device as if it might explode in front of her. Martin recovered first, though the confidence in his face no longer looked effortless. "I have no idea what you believe is on that drive," he said carefully. "But if you are attempting to imply misconduct, I strongly advise you to proceed cautiously." I almost admired how smoothly he lied. Men like Martin spend their entire lives practicing calm expressions in expensive mirrors. They believe composure itself is proof of innocence. I folded my hands together and looked at him quietly. "You should be more concerned about what Richard recorded than what I believe." Vanessa's eyes shifted immediately toward Martin. "Tiny. Quick." But enough. The kind of glance shared between two people suddenly realizing the story they rehearsed may no longer survive scrutiny. Dylan remained completely still at the far end of the table. He looked exhausted now, older somehow than he had the night before. "Mom," he said carefully, "maybe we should all take a breath before this becomes something permanent." Permanent. Another interesting word. As though betrayal only becomes real once someone finally speaks it aloud. I turned toward my son slowly. "Your father spent his final months terrified inside his own home." Dylan flinched slightly. "Did you know that?" His throat tightened visibly. "I knew he was sick." "That is not what I asked." Vanessa suddenly stood from her chair with forced indignation, sharpening her voice. "This is unbelievable. Richard loved me. Whatever private problems existed in your marriage had nothing to do with fraud." I looked at her calmly. "You are right. Fraud had everything to do with money." Martin stepped forward immediately. "This conversation is dangerously inappropriate without legal representation present." "You mean without control?" I replied softly. The grandfather clock in the hallway struck 8, each deep chime stretching through the tension inside the room. Vanessa crossed her arms tightly now, though her polished composure continued slipping in small ways. Her breathing had become uneven. One diamond earring trembled slightly beside her neck. Fear finally looked less elegant on her than confidence had. I reached toward the hard drive slowly. "Richard recorded conversations," I said. "Emails, transfers, account numbers, offshore shell corporations." Martin's face hardened completely. No more performance. No more sympathy. Just calculation. "If you distribute confidential financial material improperly," he said coldly, "you could expose yourself to significant legal consequences." There it was. Not denial. Threat. People rarely threaten consequences unless they already know the truth. Exists. Dylan looked between all of us with growing panic. "Wait," he whispered. "What offshore accounts?" Nobody answered him immediately. That silence told him more than words ever could. Vanessa finally snapped first. "Richard agreed to everything voluntarily," she said sharply. "He wanted to restructure the estate because he was tired of being emotionally suffocated for 40 years. The insult landed softly compared to the one at the funeral. Maybe because cruelty loses power once you understand the person using it is afraid. I looked directly at her. "And did he voluntarily beg Martin not to destroy his family too?" Her face drained of color. Dylan stared at her immediately. "What?" Vanessa opened her mouth, then stopped. Martin stepped between us smoothly. "This has become deeply unproductive," he said. "Evelyn, I strongly recommend we postpone further discussion until tomorrow's hearing." I smiled for the first time since Richard died. Small, calm, but real. "Oh, Martin," I said softly. "There will not be a hearing tomorrow." Something shifted behind his eyes then. The first true crack in his control. "What exactly does that mean?" he asked slowly. I reached into my purse and removed a folded business card, placing it beside the hard drive. "Harrison Cole, Federal Financial Crimes Division." Dylan's face went pale immediately. Vanessa looked genuinely confused for half a second before turning sharply toward Martin. He said nothing, which was answer enough. "I spent most of today speaking with investigators," I continued quietly. "Apparently offshore estate fraud involving terminally ill clients attracts considerable interest these days." Vanessa stepped backward slightly. "You went to the authorities?" "No," I replied calmly. "Richard did." Nobody spoke after that. The rain outside had finally stopped, leaving only silence around the house Richard and I built together decades earlier. For the first time since the funeral, I no longer felt like the ghost sitting at my own dining table. Vanessa looked at Martin now not with admiration, but with fear, because she finally understood something devastating. Men like Martin never protect anyone except themselves. And if the walls started collapsing around him, he would not fall alone. 3 months later, the roses outside the Beacon Hill house finally began blooming again. Boston spring arrived slowly that year, cold rain giving way to pale sunlight that softened the brick sidewalks and filled the city with the scent of wet earth and flowering trees. I stood beside the kitchen window one quiet morning watching gardeners trim the hedges across the street while my coffee cooled untouched beside me. The house felt different now. Not haunted exactly, just honest for the first time in a very long while. Martin Graves resigned from his law firm 2 weeks after federal investigators froze multiple financial accounts connected to Richard's estate. By the end of the month, Several private clients filed civil complaints against him after irregularities surfaced inside older trust accounts he managed for years. The newspapers called it a financial misconduct investigation involving vulnerable clients and estate manipulation. Boston society reacted the way wealthy communities always do when scandal appears too close to home. Quietly. Invitations disappeared first. Then charity boards requested resignations. Then longtime friends suddenly stopped returning calls. Reputation does not collapse all at once. It erodes politely. Vanessa disappeared from public life almost immediately after investigators subpoenaed her financial records. For several weeks, gossip columns photographed her entering hotels and private offices wearing oversized sunglasses, while reporters speculated about hidden assets and frozen accounts. But eventually, even gossip loses interest when the story no longer feels glamorous. Last I heard, she had moved to Florida and was attempting to sell jewelry that no longer belonged to her legally. Funny how quickly luxury begins to feel temporary once consequences arrive. Dylan visited me for the first time in nearly 6 weeks on a quiet Sunday afternoon. He stood awkwardly near the front door, holding a paper bakery box from my favorite Italian pastry shop in the north, and like a nervous teenager arriving for forgiveness he did not know how to ask for. He looked thinner than before. Exhaustion sat heavily beneath his eyes. "I did not know everything," he said quietly after sitting down across from me in the kitchen. "But I should have asked more questions." I stirred cream slowly into my coffee while sunlight filtered softly through the curtains beside us. "Yes," I replied gently. "You should have." He lowered his eyes after that. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Some wounds do not heal through dramatic apologies. They heal through smaller things. Honest silence. Accountability. Time. Before leaving, Dylan stopped near the hallway staircase and glanced toward the family photographs still hanging along the wall. "Dad loved you," he said softly. I looked down at my wedding ring resting against the coffee mug between my hands. "I know," I answered. "But sometimes love without courage destroys everything around it." Dylan nodded slowly because deep down he understood I was not only speaking about Richard. After he left, I walked upstairs to the bedroom that once felt unbearable to enter alone. Most of Richard's clothing was gone now. The hospital smell had faded from the walls. I opened the closet and reached for the black wool coat, hanging carefully near the back. The same coat Vanessa spat on at the funeral. The stain had faded after cleaning, but never disappeared completely. I traced my fingers lightly across the fabric for several seconds. Then I put it on. That evening, I drove alone to Cape Cod one final time before placing the summer property on the market. The ocean breeze felt warmer now than it had during the storm months earlier. Seagulls drifted lazily above the shoreline, while waves rolled calmly against the rocks below the cliffs. I walked slowly toward the old boathouse, carrying Richard's final letter folded neatly inside my coat pocket. The building looked smaller somehow beneath the spring sunlight, less frightening than before. Maybe because truth always appears less monstrous once it finally stands in the open. I locked the boathouse door for the last time and slipped the silver key into the Atlantic Ocean. The water swallowed it without a sound. Then I stood there quietly watching the horizon stretch endlessly beyond the shoreline while evening sunlight turned the surface of the water gold. Richard once told me storms make the world honest. He was right about that. Grief does the same thing. It strips people down to their truest selves. Vanessa revealed her hunger. Martin revealed his greed. Dylan revealed his weakness. And me? I discovered something I should have learned years ago. Silence is not the same thing as surrender. Sometimes the quietest woman in the room is simply waiting for the truth to finish speaking for her.